So I thought about the title for this lecture, and again, because of coming out of COVID, I thought a good title would be, What Did David Do During COVID Lockdown? And what I did was do a lot of historical research, more so than I probably would have done otherwise. Going into 2020, Election Day, November 3rd, a lot of heightened anxiety on both political sides, right, with regard to the presidential election. I was anxious, not only for the presidential election, I was anxious for another reason. These are just some of the files I had prior to that day. This is just a small portion of the archive that I have in Albuquerque. But I was anxious because I was going to have the arrival of this moving truck. And this moving truck had contained within it, as Forrest mentioned, the largest single collection of historical UFO case files in the world. And you can only imagine, I was like a kid on 10 Christmases rolled into one. This is the movers putting all of the file cabinets in place. And I'll give you a little bit of detail with regard to what was in that collection. So, as Forrest mentioned in the introduction, these are the case files from the Center for UFO Studies, the organization founded by Dr. J. Allen Hynek. It's also the files of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, one of the largest historical collections with regard to NICAP going back to the 1950s. Also, a lesser-known group, shown there in the middle, Civilian Saucer Intelligence of New York, or CSI New York, not the TV show, but the UFO organization. The original CSI, thank you. Yes, they actually were formed even before NICAP. NICAP didn't come along until the end of 1956, but CSI New York was actually active in the early to mid-50s. And we have all of their original case files, correspondence, witness sketches. I can't tell you what a treasure trove this is. And you see me sitting there between those file cabinets. That's about where I spend most of my time until my wife comes looking for me. Those file cabinets are filled. 4 and 5 drawer file cabinets, 15 total that they delivered. Thousands of case files contained therein, in addition to news clippings. And I'll share some other details with you momentarily. But I like to say that this field has no shortage of data. We are not a data short research field. We have lots of data that we can look at. While I was going through this material, as you can appreciate, over the last month and years, this is what occurred. June 25th, right? The Pentagon UFO UAP report. And Forrest alluded to this at the beginning of the conference. As he stated, the official seal of approval, UFOs are real. UAPs, whatever they are, do exist, and they have done incursions within military operations areas. Many people were disappointed by this report, and as I've said on many interviews and on various news programs, I think the people that were disappointed had their expectations set too high. In interviews that I had done prior to its release, I said, I think we need to temper our expectations. I don't say that arbitrarily. I say that because we have decades worth of denials on the part of the United States government, as well as other governments of the world with regard to the subject. However, despite the, 6 pages total, I believe it was, not really very hefty, despite the lack of information, the fact that there was official acknowledgement of the phenomenon is interesting. And for those of us that have been doing this for years and decades, you need to compare that to the historical narrative with regard to what the Air Force typically said. And it harkens back to December 1969 when Air Force Project Blue Book shut down, and these were their conclusions.
The conclusions of Project Blue Book were: 1, no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of threat to our national security. 2, there is no evidence submitted that sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. And 3, there is no evidence indicating that these unidentified objects are extraterrestrial.
Now, when you look at the UAP report, even though, again, it lacks in substance, I would argue that directly or indirectly it refutes every one of those conclusions. The mere fact that the UAP report exists was predicated on looking at UAPs as a threat or potential threat to national security. The report goes on to state that it is a national security threat as well as an air safety threat. It also goes in the UAP report and talks about the fact that our scientific understanding may not fully understand or appreciate the UAP phenomenon. With regard to the last statement, they don't say it's extraterrestrial, but we do have that wonderful, clearly defined category called other, which lends to any and all possibility. So it's very interesting in the sense that we've now shifted. And again, it has changed. It's been a sea change moment with regard to the UFO subject. And as a result, I will tell you, I've had people visit my UFO research room since that report came out. I did a local radio show for Albuquerque radio station, and it was a call-in show. I had a gentleman call in and claimed that he was a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And he said, David, I would love to see Dr. Hynek's original Project Blue Book material. I said, well, get with the producer offline, get your information. And I said, let's try to meet up if we can get our calendars to work. About 3 to 4 weeks after that, not only did he show up, but he brought a retired colonel in the Air Force who was in charge of advanced weapons development for the Air Force. I've been doing this for 31 years, or 30 years up to that point. Never had retired Air Force officers wanting to come to my home to talk about the UFO subject. And that's just one example where things are changing. More people are willing to come forward and engage in the discussion on the subject. But it really got me thinking. With the current state of ufology, there's a lot of new players coming into this, and I started really thinking about, well, what's the breakdown? I've been doing this for over 3 decades. How would I break down the UFO community? And I started thinking to myself, well, we have the UFO believers, if I can use that term, and in that group there's healthy belief, people that, like yourself, are curious, compelled by the information, and feel that there could be something to this UFO subject, or you've had your own personal experiences. Then there's also the unhealthy belief. And the best example I can think of are the 39 members of the Heaven's Gate UFO cult that committed ritual suicide in March of 1997. Now, you may think that that's an abstract example. I'm here to tell you, and Forrest can remember this as well as a few of my friends that were here, we had members of that cult here at this very conference in the year or two preceding their ritual suicide, trying to recruit members. So it is a very close to home example of where unhealthy belief can lead you. So a cautionary tale to be sure. Then we also have the UFO skeptics, the flip side of the believers, and we have healthy skepticism. I welcome anyone who is skeptical about UFOs but are at least willing to look at the data. And we have many of those. And many skeptics have actually kept UFO researchers honest with errors in our judgment or leaps of faith in looking at the data. But then you have the oppositional skeptics. These people have come out of the woodwork since the Pentagon UFO report have come out. They've been prolific on television. They've been prolific on the internet. These are people that if you say white, they're going to say black. Why? Because you said white. They just want to pick an argument and have an argument for argument's sake. And that doesn't budge the needle of understanding with regard to this UFO subject. Then you have the UFO agnostics, and I can appreciate these people. These are people that UFOs, maybe not. It doesn't impact my life. At least most people think that. And I can appreciate that. In most settings, people probably don't feel that it impacts their life. But they don't necessarily go after the UFO believers or necessarily go after the UFO skeptics. Then you have this group, and this has really developed in the last year or so since the Pentagon UFO report came out. UFO sensationalists, and I break this group down into pseudo-researchers. I know some of these people personally. They have only been in the subject for a year or two, but they're on the Discovery Channel and all these different networks doing shows, and I personally know from their own mouth that they're being interviewed as so-called experts, and they were paid to read cue cards. I like to call these people, pardon this description, meat puppets. The producer sticks their hand up their backside and makes their mouth move. The sad thing is, for the average viewer, you don't know the difference between who's credible and who's not. And again, that just muddies the water when we're trying to have an understanding of this subject. Then we also have the con artists and hoaxers. And there's a long litany of that going back to the very beginning of the modern age of UFOs. People just simply trying to make a buck, outright lying, outright fabricating information and stories. Then we have the UFO researchers. You have UFO investigators, like my friends here from MUFON, that are out doing field investigations, actually collecting as much information as soon as a UFO event occurs, and I commend their efforts. Then you have people like myself, UFO historians that have access to lots of documentation going back to 1947, if not before. And then UFO theorists, people that don't do in-field investigations, but they don't do historical research, but people like physicists that might want to look at trying to understand the propulsion technology of UFOs. They're looking at one particular aspect of the UFO phenomenon. But then we come to this category, and this is the new group that suddenly popped up since the Pentagon UFO report, UAP scientists. And I'm very careful about that, not UFO scientists. They don't want to have that term UFO associated. They're UFO researchers, we're UAP scientists. And they want to make that clear distinction. Now, this falls into two groups. You have a lot of institutions, such as NASA, that have made several statements stating that they're going to look at the UAP subject. But then you also have individuals, and Mark D'Antonio, I think this morning, had mentioned Dr. Avi Loeb. That is probably one of the best examples of an individual scientist, in this case, astronomer from Harvard, working to develop the Galileo project. And so I welcome them into the fold, but with one caveat. The UAP scientists, whether institutional or individual, they've all made statements. We do not wish to look at the past, but we'll focus efforts on cases currently and moving forward. Don't want to look at history. Don't want to look at the past. Well, they may be very smart scientists, but I think it's really strange that we are on the 75th anniversary of the modern age of UFOs. It was, June 24th, 1947, Kenneth Arnold had his famous sighting. We call it the birth of the modern age of ufology. If we're honest with ourselves, it was the birth of our awakening to the subject. It has probably been here for a very, very long time, but 47 was really where the culture woke up to this subject matter. And so I would argue now more than ever, it's important to appreciate the history of the mystery, as my friend Philip Mantle in the UK likes to call it. And it's really interesting when you think about 75 years, 7.5 decades of United States, foreign government UFO files, as well as United States and foreign civilian UFO investigators collecting data and putting it together to try to make sense of this mystery. And so I'll be touching on Philip Mantle towards the very end of the presentation because I do have some exciting updates to tell you about. But opening these case files and looking, there are numerous reports. Now, just like any UFO researcher or historian will tell you, within those files, there's a huge percentage of meteors and fireballs. Obviously, prosaic things that can be easily explained away, but people honestly reported them as UFOs. So there's a lot of clutter in the data that we have to sift through. But it's really interesting because when you look at those case files, going back to 1947 and going through the 40s and into the 50s, we didn't have reports of cattle mutilations or crop circles or government conspiracies. Those came later. And when you think about it, these case files are really the spine or the backbone or the cornerstone of the subject matter. It all started with people seeing unidentified aerial objects in the sky. So to summarily discount these sighting reports in 7.5 decades worth, I think is ridiculous in the extreme. I always like to liken it to the fact, if I'm a criminal investigator from Baltimore, Maryland, and I decide to move with my wife and kids out to Oregon, and I go to the new police precinct that I'm going to be working at, and they've had a string of burglaries. And I walk in, and imagine going with that same mindset. I know you've had a lot of burglaries over the last year or two, but I don't want to know about them. I don't want to know where they happened. I don't want to know the method of entry. I don't want to know what they stole. I don't want to know how they fenced the goods. I only want to know about crimes moving forward. It's ridiculous. The past may provide context for the present and the future with regard to UFO sightings, and there may be patterns in the data. For those that have read my book, you know that there are patterns. But there's documentation in many forms. I really feel like I want to share this archive with you as much as I can through being here. The documentation that exists in these files, we have handwritten UFO reports. We have typewritten UFO reports from all over the globe. We have signed and notarized affidavits attesting to people's UFO sightings. That's how seriously they took some of these. Newspapers, thousands of newspaper articles, news teletypes, We have crude UFO eyewitness sketches. We also have some rather artistic ones like this. There's some beautiful artwork. In fact, I thought about just doing a whole book on the artwork from these files because some of it's quite striking. We also have the original, in some cases, government files from Dr. J. Allen Hynek. It's amazing to find some of the original documents signed by the commanding officer of some of these Air Force bases, not photostats, not carbon copies. We also have, obviously, UFO photos. What UFO files wouldn't be complete without that. But we often think about photographs, but we also have some great audio. I've, just in the last year and a half, digitized and digitally remastered over 265 reel-to-reel recordings going back to the 1950s. Many of these are interviews with UFO eyewitnesses, and I've been able to pair those up with some of the case files. We even have emails from the time. Emails in the 40s, 50s sense, in the form of Western Union telegrams. So, talk about a sign of the times. You know, looking at some of these old Western Union telegrams, it's rather funny to find those now. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention my colleagues. We have Mr. Jan Aldridge and Mr. Barry Greenwood, who I'm on the phone with almost every day, if not every other day. And they are two of the leading historians on the UFO subject. Each one in their own right has extensive files and archives, and we're doing a lot of data sharing. In September, they actually stayed at my home and were live-in researchers for 2 straight weeks. And during that time, they scanned over 33,000 pages of case files. And that's just a drop in the bucket to what we're still trying to work on. These are some of the original audio recordings going back to the 1950s, courtesy of Rod Dyke, another collaborator in this attempt to preserve history and share it with the general public. And that's just my little studio table there where I do a lot of the digitization work. So I just wanted to share that with you. But it's imperative that we start doing this work because I can share some examples. These are newspaper photostats going back to this one, 1949, and you can see how it's starting to fade. We have other examples where some of the early chemically treated photocopies actually start to have chemical corrosion that starts to occur. And then we have sad examples like this where you can barely read the headline, "Sky Object Seen," but not much else in the news clipping. And looking at other pages next to those, not only do the pages themselves degrade, the pages next to them in the files are actually chemically burned, where we lose data with successive or adjoining pages. And so that's really sad to see. And then this is an example, which I actually had to call Barry and Jan. I said, "You're not going to believe what just happened." They're like, "What?" I said, "I was digitizing this tape," and by the way, this one was a Charleston, West Virginia radio station from January 1958, interviewing UFO witnesses of their sightings from that time. And as I was running the tape through the machine, I'm looking down, right, making a note, and all of a sudden I see this confetti flying up and landing on my paper. And I look up, and quite literally, as the tape was going through the machine, it was disintegrating. The magnetic strip that was attached to the vinyl backing was flaking off. And as it was going through the capstan, it was like a confetti machine. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. The good news is I had started the software application to digitize it, and I was able to actually capture the recording, which is good because, as you can see, there was no second chance on this one. But you can literally see the tape disintegrating right before your eyes and splintering. And that was a really sad example, but we got the recording, and I'm very happy because some very interesting narratives contained in there. So really the goals of myself, Barry, Jan, and Rod are to collect, preserve the historical UFO data, share it with fellow researchers worldwide and colleagues, digitally scan the materials so we can widely share them. Ultimately, what we want to do is have a digital archive free of charge. Mark D'Antonio was saying that, you know, he does his software so you can see astronomy free of charge. We do not want to charge for this either. We want to eventually get a server where we can have all of this historical digital material available for a worldwide UFO community. That's the ultimate goal. And use this material for research and educational purposes like what I'm going to share with you today. Something that brings us back to the beginning of our presentation. Note the date, May 17th, 1977. The movie Star Wars was officially released 8 days after this Memphis, Tennessee sighting. So So much for cultural influences on UFO witnesses, according to David Clark in the UK. Thank you. Thank you. Reports are consistent in their detailed narratives, and a military explanation for the entire history of reports is illogical, although we must admit or concede that some modern reports could have that in the mix. And such beliefs suggest a revisionist history of aviation and aerospace technology bordering on what I believe the delusional, to think that we had exotic aircraft like this decades ago and we're still engaged in developing inferior technologies. And common characteristics continue to exist with new data sets we examine. Just a couple brief updates I'm very excited about. I mentioned my friend Philip Mantle at the beginning in the UK. Philip has been investigating the subject for approximately 30 to 40 years, and he has an extensive archive. And within the last year, he made an official announcement that he's going to be shipping about a pallet worth of UFO data and information and case files to my home in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So what information, what triangle cases, and other information may we have in that data set? In addition, this was not part of my PowerPoint because this literally was solidified about 2 days before I came out here. A dear friend of mine, Mr. Antonio Huneas, who Forrest knows quite well, who used to be a regular speaker here on many, many occasions, contacted me. Approximately 4 years ago, I bought his extensive foreign UFO case file collection, which covers almost every country. He also has an extensive library of rare books, journals of all different countries from South America, Europe, and elsewhere. And I will be heading there where he lives 2 weeks from tomorrow, flying out one way, renting a 20-foot U-Haul truck, and loading up his entire collection of foreign books, journals, and materials, many of which date back to the 1950s. So the point is that the archive that I have in New Mexico continues to grow. We continue to get new data acquisitions, and with these collections, we can hopefully find more cases, more information. I look at all of these as data points. All of these sighting reports are data points, and so it's something to keep in mind. One of the reasons that Antonio as well as Philip are sending their material to me is because I've been working very closely with the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. I've actually lectured on the UFO subject at the university. They have an exhaustive microfilm collection, just rows and rows of rare newspapers. Contrary to popular opinion, for those that love the internet, many of these newspapers have never been digitized. The only way you're going to find the data is to go through the microfilm, which is a laborious process and one that I've done many, many times at UNM. So just with regard to talking about historical material, if you or someone you know has historical rare materials related to the UFO subject, UFO case files, just make plans for their future preservation, because these are cases where we're preserving these collections. I cannot tell you how many researchers from the 50s and 60s, when they died, researchers would contact their family and say, well, what are you going to do with your late husband's material? Oh, we threw it all in the trash last week. We've lost so many collections. So let's try not to reinvent the wheel. Let's try to preserve the data that's out there. Let's try to make sense out of it. And let's try to educate people on the history of this incredible phenomenon, with the acknowledgement that history is only one small part of this puzzle, of this mystery. Ray Hernandez was talking about consciousness and exploring consciousness. I completely agree. All of us bring something to the table, and that's wonderful about this conference. Each one of us comes at it from a different angle, but collectively, if we put all of our information together, we may have a grand understanding one day of this subject matter. And there's great work being done. Official agencies acknowledging the UFO subject, UAP detection systems. There's several exciting projects underway to collect real-time UFO data, the UAP military encounters that we've heard about, and field investigations by MUFON and independent investigators. So we can all work collaboratively and hopefully one day have answers to this mystery. Thank you.